Okay.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much for joining us. This is a zero emissions bus public workshop put on by the Metropolitan Transit System. My name is Mark Olson. I'm a manager of public relations for MTS, and I'll be helping to facilitate this meeting to make sure everything goes along smoothly as best we can. You know, it's a new environment to hold these public workshops, and so it's certainly a learning experience, but I think we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to learn a lot of good information about how MTS can convert an 800 bus fleet to zero emissions. So we're going to go into a lot of information about how and why that can be done. So the first thing I want to do, though, is just make sure we do some introductions so you know who's going to be participating in this today. So certainly, you know, first and foremost, we have Nathan Fletcher, who's the MTS board chair and San Diego County supervisor for District 4. We also have Sharon Cooney, who's the MTS chief executive officer. We have Mike Wigand, who's the MTS bus chief operating officer. Kyle Watley, who's the MTS bus zero emissions project specialist. We have Dennis Desmond, who's the director of planning at MTS. And we also have Kylie McCord, who's a senior engineering consultant for us on this project for the Center for Transportation and the Environment. So we got a big team here. You know, this is going to be a big project for us. We're really excited about it. And so we just wanted to make sure that you knew who was going to be playing a role and do some quick introductions. So how this is going to work? Well, first off, we have this presented in both English and Spanish. So that's very important. We do have a lot of people on the line right now, about 180. And so we want to make sure that we leave a lot of times for questions because it is some technical material that we're going to be getting into. And the best way to do that, there's a couple different ways you can submit and ask questions, is through the Q&A icon below. So that's like a chat feature that we have for this. So you can submit questions as we go through the presentation. And then after each presentation, we'll have some time to answer any questions that you have. We also have a virtual hand that's down there at the bottom. And you can raise your virtual hand as the presentation goes on. And then if you want to ask that question live, we will call on you and unmute you to ask that question. So certainly there's a couple different ways. And then the third way is we want to get some feedback from you on this plan. And so we want to be able to conduct some polls that will be happening throughout the presentation as another way to collect feedback from you. So with that, you know, we wanted to let you know that it'll be going through 4 different types of you know, subject matters that we're going to be going through. And so through this, there will be an electric bus pilot updates. We have a pilot that's been going on right now. Then accompanying that, we have a whole transition plan of how we can get our entire fleet to electric. Then we're going to talk about a greenhouse gas emissions study that's been done by CTE, our consultant on this. And then we want to talk about deploying these buses and deploying them in disadvantaged communities more specifically. And so we'll have that Q&A section at the time period of each section. And then we'll also have a final question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So with that, I think we'll get right into it. We want to provide our chair some opportunity for opening comments. So Supervisor Fletcher, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to thank all the participants that are here for our Zero Emission Bus Transition Plan workshop. I think we have well over 100 participants in today's Zoom call, which really indicates how important this issue is and how many communities are directly impacted by us. When I talk about what we do at MTS a lot, I talk about building a cleaner, greener, better connected future. And we know the advantages of transit in general in terms of lowering greenhouse gas emissions, lowering toxic air pollution. But in this instance, we're talking about how it's not just getting more people into transit, it's how do we fundamentally reshape and rethink about the nature of our bus system and our bus network. And this is vitally important, not just out of a sense that it's cool, the buses are electric and they're zero emission and they're green, but there are very real environmental justice issues that impact us here in San Diego County. When you take into account the reality that a child in Barrio Logan is 8 times more likely to have asthma than a child in La Jolla, you understand some of the fundamental inequities that are present. I represent in the 4 supervisorial district, a district where a child born in Southeast San Diego will live on average 10 years less than a child born in the same day in La Jolla. And from my standpoint, that is fundamentally un-American. It is immoral. And that is not going to all magically be solved by converting our buses to electric. But this is a piece of a broader effort in terms of a real commitment to environmental justice, a commitment to us being progressive and forward-leaning in tackling these types of issues. And you know, when you take into account, according to the American Lung Association, the San Diego metropolitan area has the sixth dirtiest air of 25 U.S. cities with the worst ozone pollution. You realize we have a lot of work to do. And again, that is not all caused by this, but this is a positive step forward to having cleaner air, better healthcare, and MTS as an agency committing itself to being on the forefront of adoption of things that we know will have a positive impact both on our environment, but I also believe a positive benefit economically. I do think that there's a couple of points that MTS has a good history of working on issues of having the cleanest fleet possible. It was in the early 1990s. MTS was one of the first transit agencies in California to convert from diesel to compressed natural gas, which at that time was exponentially cleaner, still is cleaner, was a positive step forward. About 10 years ago, MTS struck a partnership with Cummins, with the engine manufacturer, to build and test near zero emission engines for our buses. This test has been very successful, and every new natural gas powered MTS bus is equipped with these clean engines. MTS purchases enough renewable biogas to fuel its entire CNG fleet. But we want to do more. We want to take a legacy of being on the front end, and we want to extend that to now going to electric and true zero emission, hopefully powered by renewable power type buses. And what we're talking about, the focus on our buses, is because every one of our 135 trolleys is already zero emission. Our trolley system provides about 30 million rides every year through the heart of the communities of the MTS service area and produces zero emission. And so our bus fleet is where we move now to get on the forefront of what is possible and what we can do in terms of tackling environmental issues, health issues, but also having our agency be a leader. And that's what I want us to be, is to be seen nationally and throughout California in particular as a true leader in getting to zero emission buses as rapidly as possible. There are a lot of challenges associated with this. And I think as we go into this, it's important that we go in with our eyes wide open about the challenges that we have. Right now, electric buses cost more money. Now, the cost we believe will come down. There's potential savings in maintenance. There's other things we think that can offset this. But it is going to require a timeline and a transition to make sure that we are being good stewards of the resources we have, and that we make decisions that are mindful of the environmental impact, but also the totality of the service that we provide. We have to make a lot of initial investments in new charging technology, which are investments we're willing to make, but that's not only an investment in the technology, it's an investment in our workforce and in their safety and in building it out the right way. We have to work on the partnerships with SDG&E to make sure the infrastructure is in place to accommodate these facilities. And ultimately, other industries have to make similar investments, in particular the bus manufacturing industry, to make sure we get buses that have the range that can accommodate the routes and the topography that we face here in San Diego. And so there's a lot of work to do. It's a huge undertaking, and it's a pretty gigantic shift in the way we operate. But I want to be completely clear that as an agency and as the chair of this agency, we are 100% committed to this path and to being a leader in California. And I would like us to lay a foundation that other agencies can follow. I also sit as the governor's appointee to the Air Resources Board, where I get to work on these issues on the other end. And we're working on our draft transition plan to comply with every requirement of the California Air Resources Board. But we don't just want to meet the minimum threshold. We want to exceed, and we want to surpass, and we want to get there faster and get there sooner, as fast as we responsibly can. And we also want to do it in a way that is engaging our coalitions, our communities. So many of the folks I suspect that are on this were a part of our Elevate process. An integral part of Elevate in terms of making sure that as an agency, we are listening to the needs of the impacted communities, that we are responding to you, we are getting your input, we are genuinely listening, talking, exchanging ideas, and making sure that a public agency never loses sight that each and every one of you who are on this call are the constituency that we serve. And we are here to serve you. And I think that that is a really important point, and why I think the workshop that we're having here is an important step as we move forward. And so you're going to hear how the transition to zero emission reduces emissions. I know a lot of you are going to want us to do it much quicker, and we want to hear those voices, and we want to engage and work through the challenges and also the opportunities we have in terms of unlocking the ability to move quicker and faster. And I, in particular, want to thank our MTS staff for their efforts to this point and getting us here, and always having an open mind, and always having an open ear, and always being willing to listen to constructive criticism and feedback. Because at the end of the day, we are all in this together as an agency and a community. We're merely an extension of the community that we serve. And so the public input that we get is vitally important to us together realizing the dream of zero emission electric buses throughout our fleet, and doing that as quickly as possible. So again, I want to thank everyone for participating. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and input and direction, to a good exchange of ideas and updates on what's happening, and then really working together on the path forward. So thank you all for being here, and it's my privilege to join and participate in this. Now I'd like to introduce Sharon Cooney, our Chief Executive Officer of MTS, to make some remarks, and then we'll get started.
Today. And thank you everyone for attending. This is exciting times for MTS. We're early adopters of this zero emission bus technology. And we're really excited to move forward with the planning for the future of zero emission in San Diego. I do want to mention to you a little bit of logistics on the timeline for adoption of our eventual plan for this technology. We already did present the first draft of the transition plan to the board of directors in June. Following that, they asked us to go ahead and set this workshop up and to set up a mechanism for people to weigh in and talk to us about our draft planning. We also will be bringing this back after this workshop. We'll be taking this to the executive committee of the board of directors. At that time, we will continue to take and accept some feedback from the public on our website. We have a zero emission bus web page that you'll be able to provide comment to. And all of that information will be transmitted to the board of directors. I want to reiterate that this is not your last chance to provide feedback into this plan. This is a living document. It's our intent that every year we're going to be bringing this back to the board of directors. And that's really a nod towards the fact that the technology will be advancing through time. Our experience with the technology will instruct us as to how we can move forward. We may go faster than we can contemplate today, just based on where the technology moves us. So I want you to understand that this is something that we're going to be continually bringing back to the public for some feedback. We did try to keep it as simple as possible, but anytime you have a technical subject, it's very challenging for us. So please bear with us. We built a lot of time in here for Q&A. We'll also be periodically monitoring the Q&A section while we go through the presentation, so we can try to, at a live point, talk to any of your questions. And then I do want to say some thank yous to some key players in this. One is our MTS staff. They've done a wonderful job to date to try to get us from pilot to plan. And especially Mike Wagon, our Chief Operating Officer from the bus side of the house. And then I've also wanted to highlight a few of our key stakeholders who have been very, very engaged from day one, but also especially since we started putting this workshop together. That would be the IBEW, that would be the Environmental Health Coalition, Mid-City CAN, SD350, and countless other organizations who are really committed to clean air and GHG emission reductions in San Diego County. So with that, we look forward to continuing this discussion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mark Olson.
All right, thank you, Sharon. So the first step in this process is we want to get some feedback from you. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to do just a quick series of polls. And so we want you to weigh in and pick one of these items. So with the first poll, what we have is, what comes to mind when you first hear zero emissions bus fleet? Is it A, cleaner air, GHG reductions, B, adopting the latest transit technologies, C, quieter rides, or D, healthier communities? I think Stacy, who's also helping us out, she's kind of our central control, Stacy Bishops, who's on our marketing team at MTS, and we also have Marcial Gutierrez, who's helping out too, with the technical side of things. Are going to be trying to get us some real-time results. So that's coming in now. All right, so it looks like we got about 75% of you say cleaner air GHG reductions. That's the most important thing, so that's great. So with the next poll, we ready to launch that one? So this is a question about ridership and how often you ride. And this is all pre-COVID. We would just want to know, how often did you ride MTS in kind of pre-COVID time? So in 2019, maybe, if you want to reflect on it that way. So is it A, never, you're a non-rider, or more than once a year since riding? Rarely, so that's like once or twice a year, or special events only. Is it C, occasionally, which is once or twice a month? D, semi-frequently, once or twice a week? Or D or F, very frequently, 3 or more times a week? All right, the results are coming in. We got 30%. 30% of you are very frequently. All right, so we have a good, healthy amount of riders in here. I like that. But we also like people to learn about transit, be interested in it. So we also have 22% of you said rarely. So that's like once or twice a year. So I think that's a good combination, because I think, you know, we need to get input from everybody, and we need to see, you know, what people think if you just ride a little bit or if you're riding all the time. So that's a good mix. So the third poll, final poll before we get into the briefing on the pilot, is how would you describe your level of knowledge about zero emissions vehicles such as electric buses? So this is your overall knowledge about zero emissions buses. A, very knowledgeable, B, somewhat knowledgeable, C, not very knowledgeable, or D, not at all knowledgeable. So Stacy's getting us the results. So it looks like 50% of you are somewhat knowledgeable. So that's good. So you have some kind of foundation. Hopefully you read some of the information I sent to you ahead of time about our zero emissions bus page, which, just to remind you, we're going to have all this information available on the web page. It's particularly for those who are unable to attend. There'll be good information. And then we have 30% of you who are very knowledgeable. So certainly we have a good mix there. Okay, so next we're going to get into our first presentation, and that's going to be the overview of the Zero Emissions Bus Pilot Program, and that's going to be with Kyle Watley, who's our Zero Emissions Project Specialist. So Kyle, hand it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate this opportunity here. So my name is Kyle Watley. I'm the Zero Emission Bus Project Specialist for MTS. Just my role and responsibility is really the general overview of this pilot, and really understanding, collecting the data, analyzing, understanding the technology and how we're going to incorporate it within our system. So before I get into some of the pilot details and the actual overview of it, just kind of to go over a general question: why convert the bus fleet to zero emissions? Well, MTS has been a leader in protecting the environment and reducing these emissions, starting in 2000, converting our diesel fleet to a compressed natural gas fleet, as that was mentioned earlier, as well as now that we're looking in at our compressed natural gas fleet and moving forward to convert that into a more zero emission bus fleet. And then on the other side of that, there has been some regulation that has been coming through. California Air Resources Board recently passed the Innovative Clean Transit Rule back in December of 2018. So what that entails is basically a purchase mandate for all transit agencies in the state of California to begin procuring a percentage of zero-emission buses starting in 2023 with the ultimate goal of 100% by 2040. And what's been allowing us to be able to do this is actually the technology improvement. So, and just one thing to mention, as I mean by technology for transit, what that means to us is battery electric bus or fuel cell. So, and on a side note of that, to understand this technology improvement is, it's not quite there 100% yet in terms of a one-for-one swap with our current natural gas fleet. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about this and I move forward when I say technology. So actually to go into the pilot background a little bit, as I mentioned, battery electric fuel cell primarily focused, what we're looking at is our battery electric buses, mainly because there's a really big sensitivity with this technology. Just to name a few: hills, high speeds, the way someone drives the bus, temperature, all has a direct impact to this technology and really actually impacts how far you can drive it within a day. So our pilot right now is focusing on 8 battery electric buses. We currently have 6. We're looking to get 2 from another bus manufacturer later this year. We've already started them in service starting December 2019. So we've actually already collected some data and started to look at it, which I'll show in a later slide. And then on the other side of that, obviously we need the electric vehicle charging. So we have 12 of those that we procured. 6 are currently installed at our Imperial Avenue division, which is our primary hub for this pilot. The additional 6, which we purchased recently in August of 2020, 2 each at South Bay, East County, and Kearney Mesa. So this is going to allow us to expand this pilot out to all aspects of our region to really collect that data and analyze it. And just some information on our project cost to date. So total pilot budget is $12.4 million. Big portion of that is really with the buses. As you can see, there is a discrepancy actually between electric buses and our current natural gas buses. It's roughly a 400,000 difference. So a big part of this pilot is also analyzing this and trying to understand that. Obviously actively going out to secure as much funding as we can to help mitigate some of those cost discrepancies. And then the other side of it, project charging infrastructure. So that's roughly $2 million. And that's for the 12 depot chargers. That includes the design, the layout, and the construction, the installation of it. And then last but certainly not least is training. So we actually bumped up some of the budget for this because it is new technology. We need to understand it. We've never had electric vehicle charging units. There's some new components on the bus like batteries and traction motors that we want to definitely understand to make sure that we are thoroughly understanding what this technology means in our system. And then the big priority is safety. So high voltage is a component on these buses. We really wanted to bump up that training and that cost toward that. And so, as I mentioned before, we have some performance details that we would like to share that are part of the pilot. So as of today, we've been able to put the buses on 17 of the 95 routes, primarily out of our Imperial Avenue division. And as I mentioned before, 2 chargers at each of the other divisions, South Bay, East County, and Kearney Mesa. So we're anticipating to put them on at least 11 more routes in the near future. We're thinking in the next month for that. And in terms of the performance, some details here. So as I mentioned earlier, range limitation is our biggest concern for these buses right now. We've been able to put them on routes of 148 miles to date. So what that means is that we're looking at schedules of 150 miles or less as we start to deploy these out. And that's actually a positive because right now about 50% of our routes are 150 miles or less. So that's definitely an opportunity for us.
Hey, Kyle, is 148 miles, is that about what we expected for range?
At first, we did not. We've actually heard opposite from some of the manufacturers. They said 200 miles, 250 miles. Some of them even said a 1-for-1 swap. But as the technology started to get out there and agencies started actually doing these pilots, we were able to see 150 miles. Yes, that's probably doable. So to continue, cost per mile, what we've seen, 94 cents. Just to give you a little comparison, currently our natural gas buses are 61 cents. So out of that 94 cents, though, a big portion of it right now is electricity costs. So there may be some opportunity to see that come down in the future. Just depends on what we can maybe grab out of this from the pilot and what we can do. The other big positive is we've seen the availability and reliability. This is actually on par with our natural gas buses right now. So that's really a great thing to see. I mean, obviously what I've seen personally in the buses, we haven't really had any issues with reliability. If anything, it's more on the back end with the charger and bus communication. But as I said, this is new technology, so there's going to be some trial and error there as we move forward. And then obviously we've received some really good positive feedback from passengers and drivers. So a big one that I've heard personally is the bus is much quieter than a compressed natural gas, which is very true if you've been on it. I mean, you can hear a bunch of different indirect sounds besides the engine motor itself. And then lastly, environmental benefit. As you can see in this picture here, obviously the bus does not have a tailpipe. So there is zero tailpipe emissions out of these buses. But we'll discuss that a little bit more with some of our GHG analysis and the later slide decks. But as for the pilot, that's pretty much what I have to say. So maybe go back to you.
So Kyle, one of the questions we've received is, how did you choose where to deploy those initial pilot buses? What was your intent when you put them out?
So I was trying to get that a little bit more earlier. Environmental factors are very sensitive for these buses, specifically battery electric. So what we really tried to do is put them on routes that had a mixture of elevation, topography, high speeds, freeway, not freeway, and then as well as a lot of pickups, a lot of stops, because moving the bus, stopping it also takes and consumes energy, as well as just put it on as many routes to let drivers kind of drive them and get a feel for it, because driver behavior does have an impact to the actual range of these buses.
Okay, so overall, Kyle, you say the performance of the buses is going really well, right? It seems like that.
I believe so, for sure. In terms of the bus itself, I mean, there's still some nuances, as I mentioned, the charger, but yes, definitely.
Okay, great. We do have some questions that were submitted, so I'm going to go ahead and start with the questions that we've received. The first one is from Lindsay, and Lindsay says, is there any funding coming from cap and trade dollars, and how will the lower cap and trade revenue affect the pilot program?
Well, if I can address that one, I wouldn't mind doing that. First of all, we do dedicate most of our cap and trade funding that we get currently towards the program, and so we are doing that. But we do anticipate that, like with all of the subsidies that we receive in our agency, we will be hit with a little bit of the downturn in sales tax and gasoline tax, et cetera. So in the early years, it won't be felt as much as perhaps in years 2 or 3 after the COVID-19 pandemic is done.
Okay, another question that we have is from Rita, actually it's Sharita. Will this increase the fares for buses, this pilot program?
Well, I can take that one as well. The board has no intention of raising fares at this point.
Okay, great. Now we had another one come in from Brian, and it says, where are the buses deployed, which routes, and which communities?
So as I was mentioning earlier, right now it's our Imperial Avenue division. So a lot of it goes through the downtown, within the mid-city, uptown, down into South Bay. It really touches a lot of aspects. One thing is our routes go through many different communities. And as I mentioned before, we're installing 2 chargers each at our other divisions, East County, South Bay, and the Northern division. So you're going to start to see them come out there. But as I mentioned, we want to put them on as many routes as we can. So hopefully we'll be able to do that so everyone gets a chance to see them.
Okay, great. Now we had a couple of people raise their hands that we want to get to, and so they can ask their own questions. One of them is, we'll go to Julius. And so Stacy's going to unmute you right now, and you can go ahead and ask us your question about the pilot program. Julius, can you unmute yourself? Okay, we'll get back to Julius once we can figure out the audio on that. So I think that's pretty much, I think we have one more hand raised, so we'll get to that. We have a little bit more time in this section here. So how about Thomas? Thomas, can you unmute yourself and ask your question to the team here? Okay, you can go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I have not heard anything mentioned about hydrogen fuel cell technology as an alternative to batteries recharged from the electrical grid. And I think that from my perspective, that is a much more satisfactory long-range supportable solution to zero emission buses. There are a number of different entities around the world that are doing test pilot programs with hydrogen fuel cell technology, and it's been quite effective. The second thing, of course, is that by having a municipal entity adopting hydrogen fuel cells would give a great impetus to the development of a hydrogen infrastructure, which would be essential to the development of a broad-based hydrogen fuel cell private vehicle.
Thomas, we're right now in the section of only the pilot. We will be discussing hydrogen fuel cells later in the presentation.
Okay. The second thing I want to say is that it's been very difficult to follow along with this program because there are no subtitles. For those of us who are hearing impaired, not having subtitles makes it very difficult to participate in a program like this.
Okay, well, thanks for the feedback, Thomas. I think that's something that we can add to it when we put it on the web page. We're going to put this whole presentation on the web page, and that's something that we'll look into adding at that point too. But thank you for the feedback. Okay, we have another hand raised about the pilot program. This is from Ray. So Ray, Stacy's going to unmute you. If you could unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, this is Ray Pingle from Sierra Club, California. First of all, congratulations on your progress on the pilot program and getting your first draft plan together. In terms of the cost per mile, as you know, there's many actions that can be taken to minimize costs, particularly in minimizing and reducing electricity costs. So I'll just ask about two of them. The first is, does your cost include the revenues from LCSF? And secondly, do you have yet, and you may not because you're in a pilot, an automated smart charging system that's designed to manage when the buses are charged to minimize the electricity costs? Thank you.
Yeah, this is Mike Weigand. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here. I'll try to take those, Ray. Those are great questions. As far as the LCFS, in that number that Kyle projected to the team, to the panel, that does not count the LCF credits associated with battery electric, but it also does not count it for the natural gas.
Correct.
But those are key elements of the overall budget in the long term. I'm sorry, what was your second question, if I can ask?
So yeah, the second one was, have you installed yet a smart charging system that controls when the chargers are charging so they can take advantage of the lowest rates depending on the state of charge for the bus and so on?
Right, sorry. Yeah, the smart charging application is a key element of scalability. With the chargers that we have now, which are the charge point systems, the individual units, they're kind of, we'll call them half smart. They do have the ability to time on and off when we dictate, but you're absolutely correct. Based on peak and off-peak times and what our pull-out or integration into our daily assignments are, we have to have a system designed eventually that'll charge or ensure that all the vehicles are charged, one, in time for pull-out, but two, at the most cost-effective electricity rate. So right now, what that allows us to do is kind of minimize when they're on peak. And so right now, for the most part, all of our charging is done off peak right now. So we're trying to take full advantage of the cheapest electricity we can right now.
And if I can just add to that, actually, there's another thing, potentially it's at the CPUC level right now is SDG&E's EVHP rate. So this is gonna actually help mitigate some of those demand charges that we have noticed. And even in off-peak, there is obviously some, but still that might help bring down that cost, but that's still not yet here.
Okay, great. So we have time for one more question before we go to the next section, just so we can stay on time and be cognizant of everybody's time here. But we will get to your questions if you want to submit them in the chat box. We'll have a laundry list of all of these questions and answers for them that we'll put on the web page as well. So we have time for one more question, and we'll go to Sylvia. And Sylvia, Stacy will unmute you, and if you could unmute yourself right now and ask your question about the pilot program.
Yes, good afternoon. Like I mentioned, my name is Sylvia Calzada. I'm actually part of the committee member for the AB 617 Portside Environmental Justice Communities. I want to applaud you for implementing this incredible project that you are including. But I do have some few questions in regards to the oversight of this implementation. Do you plan to implement this in the environmental justice communities, such as National City, Barrio Logan? And as you might heard, we actually did have a fire here by the Navy. So our pollution, the air pollution has increased. I see your schedule that you included here mostly in the north side of the 94 or 805. But nothing more in the South Bay area, which is from National City all the way to San Isidro, or Barrio Logan all the way to San Isidro.
So Sylvia, I can talk to you about that. This is something we're actually going to discuss later in the program. But one of the things that we are challenged with is we only have chargers right now at one of our divisions, and that's at the 12th and Imperial Division. But we are in the process of a project to create a overhead system for charging in the South Bay. And that's going to be part of the, later on in the presentation, we're going to be talking about that as well. So those two things will be discussed further along in the program.
Excellent, thank you.
Short answer is yes.
Perfect.
We're going to get
I want to hear about it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your questions. Those were a really good jumping off point to our first presentation. And now we're going to move on to our second presentation, which is the draft zero emissions bus transition plan. So this is the plan that we have to get all 800 buses to zero emissions by the deadline of 2040 that's been implemented by CARB. And I know MTS Chief Operating Officer Mike Wygant's going to lead that presentation. He's been working really hard on this with his staff, and certainly we've had some good input from the public. But actually first, hold on, I got one more poll for you. So before we get to that, so what we want to talk about is as we roll out these zero emissions buses, we just want to know the regions that you would like to see MTS prioritize for the rollout. So we have a variety of ways that we could do that, but we just want to see what you would want us to prioritize. So let's go through the question, or the options here. And so A is around schools and universities. B is beach communities. C is disadvantaged communities. D is East County, high ridership routes for E. F is mid-city San Diego, and G is South County. So Stacy's getting the results in right now. And 53% say disadvantaged communities, which was C. So that's good. We have a whole section on that coming up, which will be, I'm sure everybody is eager to hear about that as well. And then 23% is high ridership routes. Okay, well, thank you very much for that poll. And so we'll go on to the next presentation, which I already introduced. So I'll hand it over to Mr. Mike Wygant, who will present on the transition plan.
Well, thanks, Mark. And thanks to everyone. We really appreciate your time and the input that you can provide for our draft plan. And as Sharon had mentioned earlier, it is a working document. It is a draft. We're excited about the input, and we're excited moving forward. It is a complex project. I'll try to be as concise and as clear as possible, but at the same time try to keep some of the technical side to a minimum so we can get through it. My position in MTS, I'm the Chief Operating Officer, and I oversee the day-to-day operations of what I call the rubber wheel fleet in our organization, not only the ops, but the maintenance of it. So we'll go ahead and jump right into the slide. Some of the key elements, there's a lot of elements. We could be here all day talking about the project in general, but the infrastructure, the costs associated with it, the vehicles themselves, what type of vehicles that we use. Zero emission vehicles, as mentioned earlier, are at this point technology, and I say that with the caveat because it could change, would be a battery electric bus or a fuel cell vehicle. And a fuel cell vehicle is a battery electric bus. It just has an additional component on it that allows for an extension of range. And then another big element is our workforce development. Our employees, not only our operators, but our maintenance staff, contracted and in-house, but our partners in the region, whether it be our emergency responders or even our towing services, everyone needs to get familiar and be trained on these vehicles. So infrastructure, probably the most challenging part, in all of our indications. We're working with a consultant, CTE, and they really are the leaders in the industry, and looking at all the different possible scenarios of how we can meet our goal to be zero emission as soon as possible, the most efficient and effective way. Right now, with the technology today and our constraints, and it's a little different at each operating facility based on just the square footage that you have, or the cost of electricity compared to the cost of hydrogen, or compared to the cost of natural gas. It varies at each facility, in some places pretty drastically. But what we found in our agency with our consultants' help and our industry evaluation is that the more battery electric, what we call depot charging, that you can apply right now is the most technically sound or efficient way to get to zero emission. You're going to find out later in the plan that it won't meet all of our needs. Eventually, we're going to have to transition to another application for some of our longer routes as we get further along in the transition, specifically hydrogen or fuel cell. So for battery electric, probably the biggest challenge associated with battery electric with depot charging is the footprint. Trying to charge each vehicle every night, have it ready for pullout. And right now, as you can see in these pictures, this is in Europe, but it's very similar to our facility where vehicles are parked bumper to bumper, mirror to mirror. And it's a constraint that we all have to deal with. And so the system that we've got preliminary design for, we're heading towards, is what we call an overhead structure with a gantry system. And this allows us to implement smart charging, as we talked about earlier, where the vehicle is almost in an autonomous state. It pulls in, and then from there, it's hands off. It starts its charging system to ensure that we can meet the pullout, but also to get the lowest available electricity rate within our limitations. And as we see here, it also has a charge management system. It's a key part of it.
Hey, Mike, are there any other transit agencies in the United States that have that overhead gantry system set up already?
So there's one agency in the United States that has just recently, I think it was in December, constructed the first overhead charging system. Unfortunately, they were unable to get to that next level on autonomy, where you would see what we see here, which is a telescoping device that comes off the bus and connects with the overhead charging system. They're in essence using a pull-down wheel, similar to what we have in our depot system or our pilot system. So they would need staff to go around and plug or unplug every vehicle. Our intent is to go to that next stage, which would promote the self-charging application or the smart charging application. So this is the first division. We are early adopters. We are already in the design stage. We've gone through the facility planning. The operating plan has been finalized. And what you see is our South Bay division here. And this is in the top right, a full-scale application or complete build-out, scalability, which is when we come up with these designs and we develop this application, we want to make sure it's expandable. So we're going to have our first module of this overhead charging system, like you see in the lower picture there. Our hope is to have it in place ahead of our Iris Rapid, which is going to start in 2022, and it will be using 12 battery electric 60-foot buses. So we're well on our way. We've got some of the preliminary numbers together, and we're hoping to have a final design later this year. A big part of this is working with SDG&E, our partners over there, for what we call a grid or a site assessment to make sure that we have the power ahead of the vehicles. The key here is building the infrastructure, getting in place, having all of the, the problems resolved before we get the vehicles. So here's another conceptual design. This is Imperial Avenue Division downtown. And what you see again here is the green lines on the drawing indicate the overhead structure. One thing to note here is, again, the footprint or the constraints or the capacity that we have in each division is a challenge to this transition. Although we will lose a lot less parking spots to this application or an overhead system, if you were to compare it to like our pilot system, where we have individual chargers like you see in a light duty application, that would take up a lot more room and we lose a lot of capacity. But even with the overhead system, because of the footprint structures for the overhead, the reinforcement of that, we're going to lose, close to 20% capacity. And that's important to know as we go further on the transition. We will run into those site constraints and we'll need to find another facility to allow us to continue to transition to zero emission. Even with fuel cell, we're going to have a transition period where we have natural gas and we're going to have battery electric, and to take up another section in our yards, we're going to run out of room.
So Mike, that's actually a problem that all of the large urban systems are going to face, correct?
That's correct. I mean, there are agencies in certain parts of the country that have the luxury of 20 or 30 acres and available land surrounding them. That's not a situation we're in. But if you're densely populated, you're site constrained, and you're parking your vehicles like this, which most larger metropolitan transit agencies are, this is the only way to really scale battery electric. So transition costs. So working with our consultants in CTE, we've developed a couple of different paths in which you can actually get to zero emission. We'll get into that in a little more detail on some of the other slides. But the costs associated here, what you see is the baseline. So the baseline is what we call the state of good repair of what we would have done if we continued on the existing path for the next 20 years. It's broken down by the fleet or the cost of the vehicles, the fuel, and then the maintenance. And this $1.8 billion represents what we would have spent at MTS to continue down the same path with natural gas vehicles and some level of propane on our smaller vehicles, had we not chosen to go zero emission. As you can see on the right, this is what we call the mixed fleet option. So a little spoiler alert, as we go through these slides, you'll see as we analyze different ways to get to zero emission, the most effective way for MTS is a mixed fleet. We're going to start off with the battery electric depot charging because it's the most cost-effective way. It's the fastest way to transition as many vehicles as possible to have those greenhouse gas reductions. But eventually we're going to run into a gap where we can't cover that with battery electric technology, and we'll have to transition to some fuel cells. What you see in this is a delta of a little over $640 million. So that's the challenge for us right now. We don't need it all in the first year. It's over the 20-year period, but that's a gap that we're very focused in on overcoming that challenge. So the transition. So this is moving from our current fleet, which is what you have here in these pictures, our 40-foot buses. We show a couple of different pictures here of our 40-foot, our 60-foot, or articulated buses. In the top right is what we refer to as our commuter vehicle. And then in the lower section, I'll refer to these a couple of times as minibus or paratransit, or I may even throw the phrase cutaway in there. But that's a small group of our fleet. It's less than 200. And it serves a very small amount of our ridership, but it's primarily for our ADA community and some of our routes that have really low ridership. So, but the majority of our fleet is represented in the top right. Although it's not a battery electric vehicle, The 40-foot buses represent over 500 vehicles in our fleet and are the heart of it. Right now, within the ICT regulation, it's really focused in on the 40-foot, but we have applied our transition plan as though all of these vehicles will at some point in time either be included in the ICT regulation or they will at least be considered. And we did talk a little bit about the fuel paths, but the mass majority of our fleet right now is running on CNG, and most of them are running on the near zero. And of course, we're using renewable natural gas, but we do have a small amount of propane and gasoline, and the last of the diesels leave this year, so we're transitioning away from the diesel and the gasoline vehicles. So as we transition through this with our partners, we had to do an assessment of our operation, and it's a service assessment. We look at how we operate today, how many vehicles, what our route structures look like. We had to do a lot of data collection to then determine what's the easiest path for MTS to get to zero emission, the most cost-effective or efficient process. And there really are only 4 ways to do it. And that's battery electric depot charging, which is what our pilot is doing right now. Battery electric with on-route chargers. So you see that at a couple of agencies where to extend range, they pull vehicles either out of service or they have long overlays out in revenue service where they do some charging. Or battery electric with a mix of fuel cell. And spoiler alert, that's where our data or our analysis shows us to go. And then fuel cell, applying just a straight fuel cell application. But part of that process is not only looking at the vehicles, but the total cost of ownership and what your limitations are, what your ranges are. So what this graph is trying to show, and I'll cut straight to the chase, is in 2020, which is on the far left of the graph, it breaks down our fleet by the 4 different types: the commuter, the cutaways or the paratransit minis, and also our articulated buses and our 40-foot buses, which is the vast majority of our fleet. Those are the 2 solid lines in the middle. It shows right now, as Kyle had mentioned earlier, as a combination, a little less than 50% of all of our routes, or what we call blocks, can be operated by a battery electric depot charged vehicle. That is by far at this point the most efficient way to make a zero emission bus application to our operation. But what's really interesting about this graph is as technology advances, and we've made pretty good assumptions based on information in the industry, our consultants, the OEMs, you see a steady improvement in technology, specifically battery capacity. And the keynote in this is the vast majority of our fleet, which is the 60-foot or our articulated buses and our 40-foot intercity buses, about 94% of our 40-foot buses can be operated by battery electric with depot charging by the time we get to the end of the transition. So, and we have a very high number of over 75% with our 60-foot buses. But the big challenge is going to be, if it's included in the ICT regulation, is our mini or paratransit fleet. As you can see, they're still barely reaching about 45% of the total blocks or service. So that's a challenge that we're going to be focused in on. So just a little bit more about those vehicles, not to go too far. There are very few vehicles. There's actually only 1 vehicle that we consider commercially available or something eligible for us to purchase through our FTA requirements. They have a very significant range limitation. Just to give you an idea, our typical paratransit vehicles can go between about 250 miles a day, and they regularly do it because it is a demand response. We don't actually know the exact mileage or even the exact routing that they'll do on a daily basis, whereas the electric bus that is available today can only do about 70 to 75 miles usable. So that's a significant limitation. The cost, they're about 3 times as much today. We expect that will balance out over the next few years. And they are a shorter service life vehicle. A typical transit bus is a 12 to 14-year vehicle, where these are a 5 to 7-year vehicle. So trying to manage that cost over a shorter period of time is difficult. With our paratransit vehicles, as we mentioned earlier, we've been very focused in on reducing our overall emissions. And as we've gone to propane, it represents more than a 60% improvement in emissions really compared to the prior fleet of gasoline vehicles.
So, Mike, what you're telling us is that you're saying the plan is going to reflect that this technology right now isn't really where it needs to be for us to transition the minibus fleet. But if I'm remembering correctly, the ICT does not apply to that fleet anyway.
Correct. Currently, the ICT regulation only applies to our 40-foot vehicles, vast majority of ours. But the regulation does show that there will be regular check-ins with the technology, and as early as 2026, they could reevaluate and reconsider that our paratransit or minibus fleet may be inclusive of it. But it's all really based on the technology.
And that's where our living document comes into play, that as that steps up, that's where we're going to move with it.
It's probably one of the largest challenges other than the infrastructure right now. It shows the biggest gap between what we do today and how we would run with the zero emission bus. Basically trying to stay focused on a one-for-one replacement. All of our analysis is, or our plan is based on that we can maintain that one-for-one replacement. So what you see in this chart is actually the composition of our fleet, the 800 vehicles in the fleet, what we are today. It breaks it down by the vast majority of our vehicles are natural gas. We have the propane vehicles on our light-duty mini or paratransit fleet. And what you see in the green as we transition between now and 2040 is the implementation of the battery electric and the fuel cell vehicles. It's a pretty aggressive transition, but it still shows some gaps. Some of those gaps at the end in 2040 are based on procurement schedules and when buses meet the end of their useful life. And again, some outliers, some vehicles that are going to be outside the range limitations based on ourselves and the consultants' estimates of range improvement. The next slide. So this is basically our annual vehicle purchases. So we, on our buses, we typically buy about 50 buses, heavy-duty buses a year. And we buy quite a few propane, I would say 15 to 20 for our minibus service. But what this graph is showing you is the purchase as we transition to zero emission, how the vehicles are going to be transitioned from internal combustion vehicles to battery electric or fuel cell. A couple of key notes on here. Our last CNG purchase would be in 2028 with our current draft plan. Also, you'll notice in 2033 and again in 2039, the darker section of the bar. That is specifically the paratransit fleet that we mentioned. They're not included right now. They're just such a large gap in whether or not they can be feasibly used on a one-for-one replacement that we're showing them on that graph. But technology could improve. And the moment that it's readily available, obviously those will be transitioned over to a zero emission vehicle. So
before you go on to the workforce development aspects, there were a lot of questions about what's incorporated within our pricing and how we've kind of looked at this. And part of it is, the cost for electricity. There's a lot of interest in that. And there's also a lot of interest in reductions in maintenance costs associated with this new technology. Do you envision that this is something that you'll continue to monitor and that there'll be changes in the plan going forward?
absolutely. As we had mentioned before, our plan is to come back to the board annually to give them any updates, not only on the technology, but our performance and what we're seeing, and we can adjust our plan accordingly. Right now we're using electricity rates that we're getting from our pilot as a basis. We use our natural gas rates that we have today. The maintenance costs, you have to compare a new warranty vehicle, whether it be battery electric or CNG, to make your comparison. We do expect overall in the day-to-day maintenance in a battery electric or a zero emission vehicle to produce, and you can see that in our numbers, to have some improvements over the combustion vehicles on the maintenance cost. What's an unknown is really the length or the life of a battery. And that would also apply to a fuel cell vehicle. They do have a battery, and which one you buy, they could be more dominant, but they may require a midlife or a replacement of the battery, and that's expected to be a pretty high cost. So that could swing it one way or the other.
Yeah, there was another question about whether hydrogen was an option for the minibus fleet.
So actually, for the most part, hydrogen we think is going to be one of the better solutions would be a paratransit fleet, just because the limitations of a battery and the weight of the battery. Unfortunately, right now, that technology doesn't exist. No one has even developed that. It's a pretty significant investment in a vehicle that typically is a much lower price. But if we're going to get the range, as you can see in this chart right here, we see a significant gap in the outer years. And so I think hydrogen may surface in this area. That's an area that I would focus in on if I was a developer, just because of the longer range.
Okay, I guess we might as well move on to the next segment.
So a real quick slide about workforce development. You know, all of our partners, both internally, our own employees, our operators, but also our partners within the region, we really need to focus in on providing a safe environment. And so it really requires a lot of training. It requires a lot of procedures and processes. Luckily, MTS has a pretty well-structured, what we call our apprentice program, where we take, in essence, people off the street that want a good job, that don't have any real or very limited maintenance background, and we go through a 4-year program with our local community colleges to make them journeymen, develop into journeymen. It's a long-standing process that we worked with our partners with the IBEW on, and we're really proud of it. Some of the key elements of it are obviously the high voltage safety training that we talked about earlier, but there are a lot of systems that are unique to a ZEB bus specifically. Of course, everyone knows about the batteries, but the battery management system, the propulsion system, some of the, all the lighter subsystems that we typically would have on a combustion vehicle have to be converted to electric. So we can't rely on pneumatic or hydraulic. So there's quite a few changes in the vehicle. But as I mentioned, some of our other partners, like the first responders, the fire department, the police, they have to get trained for this vehicle. We go through that process with all of our vehicles, but this one's a little unique because it's battery electric. Even our towing services, they have to understand the process for that. One other thing to point out here is, you know, part of the biggest challenges we mentioned earlier is the infrastructure and the construction aspect of it. We are also insisting that all of our construction partners through this process of transition have a specific training unique to make sure they're safe too, and that's called the EBITB program. So another thing that we mentioned we do quite a bit of is keeping in touch with our local agencies, and I just put together a couple of slides that go over some of the early adopters. LA Metro is big. We've got obviously the largest fleet in the state. They had committed in 2016 to go 100%, as did Foothill. But both of them have run into challenges. Some of it's been on the infrastructure or really the range limitations. The technology hasn't advanced as fast as they had hoped, or the infrastructure had delays or challenges that they were unable to overcome. Inadvertently, both of them have had to since amend their plans, and both of them currently are buying combustion vehicles to bridge the gap. And when I say bridge the gap, that's a phrase that I will use regularly. It's to get us to that full transition, to get us some vehicles that we can continue to operate in a one-for-one replacement. Both of them are still looking at fuel cell also because they realize there are some limitations to battery electric. A couple other agencies that get a lot of notoriety is Antelope Valley. Again, in 2016, they had committed to 100% ZEB by 2018. They have run into some challenges. They've made great progress. We've learned a lot from their application, but they have come short. They're about 50% today. They also have a different operating environment. They are in the high desert near Palmdale and Lancaster, have quite a bit more land, so they can focus primarily on individual charters like we use for our pilot. That's an advantage they have. And NCT, our partners to the north, they're well invested into it, but they're a little bit behind us. They do have a consultant on board, but no ZEBs on order as of yet. So just to kind of come back around some of the main considerations and concerns that we really need to stay focused on for a successful transition is the infrastructure. It's clearly the most challenging part. trying to develop a program that will allow us to get zero emission that's modular and scalable, and it's the most efficient process. Eventually, assuming ridership and the service that we provide stays at a neutral level over the next 20 years, we're going to eventually run out of space. Even as we go to fuel cell, we're going to need more property. The grid capacity and the redundancy, those are the things that we're working through with SDG&E, trying to have the right amount of power at the right amount of time. Some of our facilities could need 6 or 7 megawatts, which is a pretty substantial amount. Funding, we've talked about, we continue to look under every rock for every dollar, and we'll be successful for that. And then really just watching the minibus or the paratransit application and see what surfaces that can provide a better solution to lessen that gap.
All right, Mike, thank you very much. That's a lot of information, and certainly it was great. We had a lot of questions submitted, so we're going to get right into that so we can hear what people are thinking. The first question I want to talk about is from Lindsay, and so she says, what charging infrastructure currently exists and what infrastructure needs to be built to support the new vehicles? Are there any partnerships to pay for this infrastructure? I think you touched about that at the beginning, where it's really got to build the infrastructure first before you can really start to pump up the fleet. Is that right, Mike?
Right, yeah, it won't do me any good if I have a bunch of battery electric buses and no way to charge them. So clearly we have to have the infrastructure first. The infrastructure that we're using for the pilot is not scalable because as you see in some of these pictures that we park buses bumper to bumper, mirror to mirror, we need to find another way. So it's underneath the bus or over the top of the bus, or the gantry system. Europe's had some great success in that. The US is a little bit behind the curve. No one's actually done it in a scalable, more of an autonomous approach just yet, but several people are working on it. As far as partners, SDG&E, clearly they have a couple of different programs that we're watching mature, and we're working with them regularly, providing a lot of input. And we're hoping they're going to be able to come in and help us with a lot of that, especially when you get into the grid to the fence, or what we call the transformers and the switch gears and the piping. Even some of the chargers, some offset some of the costs of the chargers. So we're looking to work with them.
So SDG&E needs to build infrastructure as well to accommodate the charging needs that we would need for a fleet. It's not like they can just flip a switch and we can use the...
None of our facilities have even a small portion of the grid that we would need at scale.
All right. Okay, we're going to go to another question here. This one is from Oscar Medina. Do you plan to put the buses in communities like National City?
So I think we'll go through that a little bit more in the next area with our rollout plan for the vehicles and what communities, but the answer is yes.
Okay, this is from Joan. Has the general reduction in ongoing maintenance on electric vehicles as opposed to traditional buses been considered in drafting up this budget?
Yes, absolutely. There is an assumption of a reduction in overall maintenance costs. Clearly, I would be in agreement that we'll see that on the day-to-day side of it, and the overall cost for maintenance is less in our cost estimate.
Okay, great. We have another question from Toshihiko, and this is: the chairman stated that MTS wanted to become a leader in ZEBs in California. Is he talking about the transition of 100% to ZEBs and the timing of that?
Well, I don't want to speak for the chairman, but clearly that is our goal. We're trying to do this as fast as the technology will allow us within the constraints that we have. I mean, we've shown that even the regulation doesn't require any zero emission buses for a large agency until 2023. Before we get to that regulation, we'll have a minimum of 20 buses and hopefully the first state-of-the-art overhead charging infrastructure in North America. It's going to be close. There's a couple other places that are working hard on it too.
So Toshi, I think what the chairman was trying to make clear to everyone on this call that the board is 100% committed to moving as quickly as possible. And so within the constraints of the infrastructure and in the constraints of the technology, they want us to press as fast as we possibly can. And so the transition plan, as you see it today, could speed up within the next coming years as we move forward with learning about the technology.
So Sharon, it could be 2038 or 2035. It just depends on how quickly this technology develops
Correct.
and comes online into the commercial space that we're in.
Yeah, and the big piece is the charging infrastructure. How quickly can we get charging infrastructure into all of our various bus divisions? How fast can SDG&E get the transmission of electricity into those locations? Are they going to have the capacity to fuel or to charge so many vehicles, heavy duty vehicles that require, you know, households full of charging each evening? Those are a lot of big hurdles that we're going to be moving forward as we implement this transition plan.
Okay. So another question that we have is from Haney. Is the cost per mile data based on what we've been observing during the pilot, or estimates full cycle costs, including when batteries need to be replaced?
So the cost per mile that Kyle had showed earlier is specific to the pilot. And that's in a comparison to the cost per mile on our newest CNG vehicles, which are actually about 2 years, a year and a half older than the battery electric. When you look at our overall cost of the project, that takes into consideration not only reduced maintenance, but also what we're hoping to get a reduced cost of electricity with our partners with SDG&E. And yes, there is an assessment based on the OEM, or we have applied battery replacements as a midlife from the information that we've gotten from the OEMs and the consultants.
Okay, this question is from Julio. Who will you be purchasing the batteries from?
Well, the batteries are coming directly from the OEMs, or the equipment manufacturers, the New Flyers, the Gilligs, the Proteras, the BYDs. They all have slightly different battery chemistries and different chemistry suppliers, but typically on something like this, we would buy them direct from the OEM. We wouldn't go out and try to source the batteries separately.
So you buy the bus and you get the battery with it.
Right, and if there were a midlife, that would come most likely going to come from the OEM also, or a supplier that they authorized.
Okay, so this is an anonymous question. Does electrification apply to MTS staff fleet, like admin and maintenance? And is there a plan for that?
So we lease most of our admin vehicles, but we are looking at that. We have looked at hybrids. We looked at the most efficient way. But the short answer is, yeah, we're considering that and looking at that. Right now, we've been focused a lot of our resources on the fleet. It's the bigger challenge. It's the bigger emitter. But yeah, we're clearly looking at that as our plan. But the ICT regulation, that's not encompassing of it.
Okay, so we have a question from Dan. Can we increase ridership with the same amount of buses?
Can we increase ridership with the same amount of buses?
Thinking of that, if it was regular, or like a fuel-powered bus versus an electric bus, would ridership be the same?
Well, you know, the vehicles are constrained what we call total capacity on the vehicle based on the gross vehicle weight rating and the capacity limits. Right now, that's actually been a challenge for zero emission bus manufacturers to try to keep vehicles with the same capacity. So the limitation with ridership within the vehicle is pretty neutral. It definitely isn't going to improve. If it did, they would add more batteries so we get more range. But myself personally, the nice clean bus that tracks ridership, I'd like to ride in it. So
Right.
we gotta look at it that way.
Okay, so we're going to go to a few hand-raised questions so people can ask live their questions to the subject matter experts. So first, we're going to ask Naomi. And Naomi, Stacy's going to unmute you. If you could please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question about the transition plan, the draft transition plan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Naomi Sanchez, and I'm a resident here in Barrio Logan. And I want to know if you have looked into ways to make this zero emission plan happen in a shorter amount of time. If we don't make a difference now, the air is going to be way too polluted in 20 years. That brings other health concerns like respiratory and skin problems and other issues that come from bad air. I've seen a lot of fires recently because it's so hot. Anything will light on fire. Also, I don't know anyone in my neighborhood that has AC, and it's already so hot. This means more people could die and get sick from the heat. We can't wait 20 years to change all the buses to zero emissions. I'll be 38, my parents will be in their 60s and 70s. We're gonna have to move away if the air quality doesn't get better here. We're still in a place where we can stabilize temperatures now. Once the climate is damaged, there won't be any amount of money that will make it go back to normal. I get that these buses are expensive, but we need to invest in our community's health before it's too late. Please convert to all zero-emission buses in a shorter amount of time. We need to set an example for other cities so they all start adopting more zero-emission buses too. Other cities like San Francisco are already doing it, so why aren't we? Please consider faster transition plans. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Naomi.
Yeah, absolutely. We continue to look at every available option to accelerate it. And not to really go back to some of the challenges we've pointed out before. But the biggest problem today, if we had all the money and we had all the infrastructure, is only half of our routes, or less than half of our routes, could be operated by a commercially available zero-emission bus. So that means we would have to double or even triple our fleet in some cases. But really, as these advance over the next 20 years, the challenge is going to be the infrastructure. Building the infrastructure ahead of it, building as fast as we can. We've looked at other scenarios, some accelerated in the early years, and also being zero emission earlier than the 2040 goal. And we'll take all those steps as they become available. But we can't really go back in time. You look at some of these vehicles, they're 12 or 14-year vehicles. If I tried to say I wanted to be zero emission by 2030, I have vehicles I bought this year and last year and the year before where I'd have to get rid of them before the end of their useful life, which would be a challenge in addition.
Okay, so the next question we're going to go to is a live question from Lane. So Lane, Stacy is going to unmute you, and please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, great. Can you hear me all?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So I, along with Bill Powers, got the community choice aggregation energy movement off the ground in 2011 and remain really supportive of this initiative underway at MTS. It's fantastic. And I'm just wondering if we might collaborate with you so that you consider possibly alternatives, because you do have choices now, to developing this under the aegis of SDG&E, but possibly developing it as developing your own power procurement and your own site, say, for example, in Otay Mesa, where you have lots of real estate and transmission, and then you become your own power provider for your buses, as opposed to being strictly a retail customer. You could actually become possibly a hybrid under a microgrid scenario. So I'm just wondering if we might be able to elaborate a little bit more on that, maybe, a subsequent meeting or something like that.
Yeah, we would love to partner with anyone. What it's referring to is self-generation. And we have looked at that. We even applied for a grant. We were hoping to be awarded. Unfortunately, under the low-no program, we didn't. But those are things that, as we talked about earlier, this plan is a living document. This whole process is going to change. I guarantee it's going to change every year, not only based on technology, but other pathways. And so self-generation is something we have clearly looked at to lower our overall cost of the electricity, which right now is one of the higher costs of it compared to our current standard with natural gas. So absolutely, good points.
So we had a question that was in the Q&A. Are there any plots of land available where we could set up our infrastructure and really expand the fleet that way? We have been looking for that. San Diego County real estate is not inexpensive. And also the large industrial lands are not that available anymore in San Diego County, at least not where we need them, which is right in the urban core. But we are looking for that, and that cost of that land and development of a new bus division is not incorporated in the budgeting that we've talked about in this presentation.
Okay, for the sake of time, we need to move on to the next section. We have two really important sections. It's going to be new information on a GHG study that was done by our consultant, as well as connecting with disadvantaged communities. So we need to move on, but those people who had their hands raised, please put your comment or put your question in the chat room, and we'll be sure to log those in, and we're going to go back and make sure that all of these questions are answered. But next we're going to go to the poll, and so here we go. So what we want to know is what you thought about the plan here that we just talked about, and what do you think about a 20-year conversion path for 800 buses? So A, I think it should happen quicker than 20 years regardless of cost. B, I think it should happen quicker than 20 years as long as cost does not impact service levels. C, I think it should take longer than 20 years. Or D, I think this is a good timeline. So we'll wait for Stacy, she's tallying it up. Okay, so we're waiting for more people to respond. Giving this lots of thought, so that's good. Okay, so A is, says 40 people said A. Is that a percent? Okay, so 40% said A, this should happen quicker than 20 years, regardless of the cost. B is 35%, and then C is 1%, and D is good timeline is 22%. So, A, B, and D all did pretty well. So, okay, great. So we'll move on to the next section here, which is going to be the GHG study. And so leading that's going to be Kylie McCord, who's a senior engineering consultant for the Center for Transportation and the Environment. So Kylie, we'll send it over to you. And you're on mute, so I think you need to unmute yourself.
I can begin this by talking about the fact that we've had significant feedback from stakeholders and people who came to the board meeting and board members themselves. They really wanted to see a comparison of different strategies and how they may impact GHG reductions. And so that's where you're going to see a little bit about right now from our consultants.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, my name is Kylie McCord. I'm a senior engineering consultant with the Center for Transportation and the Environment. Just a little bit about CTE is we're a nonprofit organization with a mission to help advance clean, efficient transportation technologies to the marketplace. So we're not your traditional consultant. This is basically what we do is working to help transit agencies, industry move towards zero emission technologies. And we've been on the project since 2018 and appreciate the opportunities here. Wanted to take a 30,000 foot level here to look at the greenhouse gas inventory for San Diego, and this is for the region. The data is actually from 2012, but really what I'm interested in here is to kind of show not the specifics of the actual emissions, but the percentages that make up those emissions. So about 50% of the emissions in the region, the greenhouse gas emissions in the region, are from transportation. 37% of that is from passenger cars and light duty vehicles. And about 5% is from heavy duty trucks and other vehicles. And that 5% is where these heavy duty buses transit fall into the overall perspective here. So just wanted to kind of give you an idea of what the overall emissions look like. So we were tasked with taking a look at a number of different scenarios for greenhouse gas emissions for the transition. The different scenarios that we looked at were a couple that Mike Wygant talked about before, the baseline, which is continuation of using fuels, CNG and propane. We looked at the mixed fleet scenario, which is what Mike went through in detail, which is a combination of battery electric and fuel cell technologies. And then we also looked at a couple of additional scenarios, which were early adoption of battery electric vehicles in the early years of the transition. 25% of vehicles purchased between 2020 and 2022 before the CARB mandate takes effect. And then finally, one of the questions earlier was asked about accelerating this transition. And so one of the things that we looked at was also accelerating what the impact to greenhouse gas emissions was by accelerating to 2030. Actually, you can go back to the first slide, yeah, the 2040 transition. So to give you an idea, what we do when we do this emission evaluation is we're looking at the fleet as a whole. We have all of the mileage information, we have all of the fuel use information, how long the vehicles operate each year, and so we can estimate those emissions from the tailpipe. We also incorporate into that what we call the well-to-wheel emissions calculation, and that's actually what you see here. So the well-to-wheel emissions calculation includes the emissions that are associated with the production of the fuel. So in the case of natural gas, it's the production of natural gas. In the case of electricity, it's what emissions are generated from the power plant. And hydrogen, it's the different emissions associated with producing that hydrogen fuel for transportation use. So that's why when you look at the end of this transition, you don't see zero. There's not zero emissions because we're actually looking at all of the fuel use that it takes to generate this. We did an evaluation as well on the tailpipe emissions, so we have those calculations as well. But what we've presented here this evening is these well-to-wheel emissions. And so what you see is in 2019, this is comparing the baseline scenario, which is in the orange, to the mixed fleet scenario. In 2019, you can already see the impacts of some zero emission vehicles that were purchased, battery electric vehicles for the pilot. And through the years, as more vehicles are purchased, and this is on the schedule that Mike Weigand presented before for the purchase of the vehicles, you see this gap increasing between what the emissions would have been versus what we estimate them to be. For using the zero emission technologies. The difference at the end of this transition is about a 70% reduction from what you would have seen by using those legacy fuels. It's 100% reduction at the tailpipe, but a 70% overall reduction in emissions for the region. Looking at the early adoption, so as I said before, this is basically purchasing 25% of any vehicles that MTS purchases between 2020 and 2022 as being zero emission. The CARB mandate comes into effect in 2023, and then so it follows the schedule that was previously laid out beyond that. You see some of the similar trends. You'll get a better idea of the comparison of this on a later slide, but ultimately it's just over a 70% reduction as well at the end of the transition period. There are some challenges with moving up purchases. I think Mike's already talked about some of the infrastructure challenges. There are also challenges with actually having buses built because ultimately, typically you're looking at a 12 to 18 month time frame when you contract for the purchase of a vehicle to the actual vehicle being built. So there are some schedule implications that would make it challenging to purchase anything at this point in 2020. And finally, we looked at the benefits for a 2030 transition. And certainly, I think Mike has already gone through many of what those challenges are, particularly infrastructure. But what you see here is obviously significant decrease in your greenhouse gas emissions, the green line, for that 2030 scenario. So by 2030, the only emissions that remain are those from production of fuel, whether that's electricity. In this case, it's actually, there's a fair amount of hydrogen production, because by moving the purchases forward, MTS ends up purchasing more fuel cell electric vehicles to meet range requirements. So they have to purchase those vehicles earlier to meet some of the range requirements. And so you can see that you're ending with in 2030 beyond is only production of the energy required to operate these buses. And then, so we've got a comparison here of these different scenarios. And obviously the top orange line is the baseline, flat for the duration of the transition period. The heavy green line is the mixed fleet scenario that Mike presented earlier. This dashed line is the moving up the 25%, the early adopter scenario. See, what you see here is there's some improvements in the early years, and all the way out to about 2032. Things merge together as MTS ultimately replaces all of these later vehicles as you get further on in the replacement cycle. And finally, this is the mixed fleet transition by 2030. When you get to 2030, those emissions are solely from the fuel that's being purchased. But obviously, you can see a significant reduction from any of the other scenarios by accelerating to 2030. The differences in the cumulative impacts of the total emissions throughout the transition scenario is, let's see, sorry, I had those numbers. It's about 30% for this scenario. So 30% reduction from baseline total emissions over the period. A little more than that for this, and around 52% reduction with this accelerated 2030 scenario.
Well, thanks, Scott. Are you wrapping up, or do you have a little bit more?
No, we actually have the slides, or we have figures for the tailpipe emissions, but they were not included in this portion of the analysis.
Okay, and I think eventually we can expect a full report on that. This is just kind of the first information that's
absolutely. Yeah, it'll be included in the zero emission bus transition study.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have a few questions on this. One is from Tara. So when do you expect the charging stations to be 100% fueled by clean energy?
That's probably more of a question for SDG&E. They have some projections, but you make a good point in that as the renewables increase over time, that will certainly improve those emissions. But the SDG&E right now. I don't recall exactly what the percentage was of renewables within their mix, but that's what we used as our basis for these this analysis.
Okay. Well, I think that's the only question we had. So if anybody has any other questions, oh, actually, we have a couple hands raised. So let's go to that. So we have the first one is Esperanza. So Esperanza, if you want to take yourself off mute, Stacy will unmute you.
Correcto, ya. Ok, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Esperanza González, promotora de la Coalición de Salud Ambiental. Al principio, el supervisor Fletcher mencionó que en algunas comunidades existen más enfermedades respiratorias. Ok. Él tiene el conocimiento, ¿verdad?, de que hay enfermedades en diferentes comunidades. Entonces, para nosotros es necesario que consideren poner los buses en las comunidades donde hay más contaminantes de gas invernadero. Es indispensable que den prioridad a comunidades de justicia ambiental. Es necesario, es urgente. Gracias.
Okay, thank you, Esperanza. And I think we're going to get into that analysis a little bit more in the next presentation. So, you know, certainly that's good information, and we'll share a little bit more on that in the next presentation. We do have a couple more hands raised. So the next one is for Daniel. So Daniel, please take yourself off mute, and Stacy will unmute you and ask your question.
Yes, Stacy, and thank you very much. It's a great report to find out some things. And we have questions about SDG&E because we don't even know if they're going to be our utility provider, seeing that we're going through a franchise fee. I'm with the San Diego 350 and in the transit and transportation group. And what I think that we should try to do is, what if we look to have the community invest into microgrids through solar? If we had the disadvantaged neighborhoods get into big solar programs, which could be funded by federal and state dollars, and also the utility, then you could charge them up right there in the community. You might be able to charge them up in some areas that are brown zones right now, and get the land for low or cheap or free. And that way they might be able to get paid back for charging up the buses that they use in their own community that benefit their community and benefit us all. Another thing that we could do to get funds to do this is to offer bonds that are low cost bonds that are like $20 to $100 per bond, and people could be invested and gain a little wealth at the same time, not at a high rate. Just like when they're going to sell the electricity, they're going to sell it at a lower rate than SDG&E, but still benefit. And I think we can think about this and really benefit our community, not just in the transit, but also in the energy and pollution sector too.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That was very interesting. You know, that's the kind of conversations that we can have on our web page. So I'm going to give it another little plug. Feel free to provide comments like that as well after tonight's workshop. I did have one more question I wanted to ask. Are there battery disposal costs, and are those included in the fleet cost comparison against baseline analysis? And are there assumptions about costs with respect to compliance on any environmental regulations on battery disposal? So in essence, it's a lot of question about battery.
Yeah, battery disposal. Well, you know, it is a big unknown. No, there is no cost of battery disposal built into our cost analysis. From talking to some of the manufacturers and kind of to the prior question, one of the possible solutions for battery disposal would be reusing them. They're going to get to a point, most likely, according to all the estimates from the experts, where they won't perform at a high enough level to provide us the range that we need, but they still have a use. Similar to your cell phone, as you see over the years of use, it starts to deplete its capacity on a daily basis. So we're looking at the possibility of using that for additional battery storage in our facilities or any other scenario we can use it for. But you know, basically battery storage on the facility to capture electricity at the lower cost, to then reuse it. If that battery has a reduced performance level, I can still build that in the construction. So it's really like an unknown, but no, it's not in the cost.
Okay, so for the sake of time, we need to get going because we have about 20 minutes left and we want to get to this last presentation. There's been lots of good questions. We'll make sure that we answer them all and post them to the webpage so everybody can see that. So the last section that we have here is connecting with disadvantaged communities. And so Dennis Desmond, who's the MTS Director of Planning, has been working on that. But actually, I did this again, so let me actually backtrack a little bit and go to the poll. So let's go ahead and do that. So just heard about GHG emissions. We want to get a little bit of feedback from you there. And so after seeing the difference in GHG emissions for the 3 different scenarios, I think the best plan is A, the 25% early adoption rollout, the 20-year full transition, or B, the 10-year full transition plan, no matter what. C, the 10-year full transition plan, as long as service levels are not impacted. Or D, the 20-year full transition plan as is. So Stacy's tallying the numbers and we'll have the answers for you in a second. Okay, so it looks like C was the most popular, the full 10-year transition plan as long as service levels are not impacted. Okay, well, thank you very much for participating in that poll. And now fast forward to where I was earlier. And Dennis Desmond, our Director of Planning, will talk about connecting with disadvantaged communities through this transition plan. Dennis?
Great, thank you, Mark. My name is Dennis Desmond. I'm the Director of Planning for MTS. Since we began engaging stakeholders on our electric bus efforts, we've heard a strong advocacy for prioritizing our rollout in communities of concern that have been historically disadvantaged economically and environmentally. And we've heard that echoed this afternoon. Thank you to Oscar, Sylvia, and Esperanza for chiming in on that today. The state of California also recognized the need for investments in these areas, and Senate Bill 535 directs that a portion of proceeds from the state's cap and trade program be allocated specifically to these communities. To achieve this, the state built a statistical tool called CalEnviroscreen that incorporates many metrics into an overall composite score for every census block in the state. The metrics are based on the pollution burden and the population characteristics of each census block, which are shown on the table on the right. Using this composite score, Senate Bill 535 defines the top 25% of the most challenged census blocks as disadvantaged communities, or DACs as you'll sometimes hear them called, or abbreviated. For purposes of this ZEB transition plan, we've started by using these state-defined disadvantaged communities as the proposed priority areas for the rollout of our electric bus fleet. On the next slide, thank you. The screen shows the current SB 535 disadvantaged communities in the MTS service area. They're mostly centered around the San Diego Bay, but also include areas in the southeastern communities in the city of San Diego, as well as a portion of central El Cajon in the East County. The inset here shows a little better detail of the boundaries of the San Diego DACs, or disadvantaged communities, with most of them south of the 94 freeway and west of Euclid Avenue. I'm going to be showing a number of maps on the next few slides, and all of those maps will include these areas highlighted in purple shading as they are in this one. This map looks like it might be a little bit difficult to see, but this map shows all of MTS's bus routes overlaid on the map of the SB 535 disadvantaged communities. The red lines here show routes that don't have any stops in any of these communities. The green lines show MTS bus routes that have at least one stop within a disadvantaged community as defined by SB 535. What's interesting is that because the SB 535 definition is fairly narrow, there's only one out of our 96 bus routes that's completely within disadvantaged communities, and that's our Route 5 along Market Street. A lot of routes only have one or a few stops within a disadvantaged community, with the rest of the route beyond the DAC boundaries. As Mike Wygant discussed earlier, the real key component to deployment of the electric buses is getting the charging infrastructure installed at our maintenance and storage facilities, which we call divisions. We have 4 divisions that primarily house our standard 40 and 60-foot buses that, as Mike talked about, we're focusing on right now. These are shown by the location markers on the map on the right. The green marker in downtown San Diego is our Imperial Avenue division here in the East Village. The yellow marker towards the bottom of the map is our South Bay division in southern Chula Vista on Main Street. The red marker on the right is our East County division in northern part of El Cajon. And the light blue marker in the center top left of the map is our Kearny Mesa division. The bus routes operating out of each division that use the standard and 40 and 60-foot buses are shown in the same color as the marker. Routes in dark blue are operated simultaneously out of both our downtown Imperial Avenue and Kearny Mesa divisions. It isn't accidental that routes tend to be operated out of the division closest to their endpoints. This minimizes the amount of time and distance that the buses need to travel out of service to get to and from the start of their route. This is especially critical when we talk about electric buses due to their limited range. We don't want to eat into that range just to get to and from the division without any passengers on board. For these maps here, I've broken out each division separately. The routes shown in color on each map are routes that have at least one stop in an SB 535 disadvantaged community. The routes that are grayed out have no stops in a DAC. On the left map are Imperial Avenue and Kearny Mesa divisions, which I've combined here because so many routes operate from both. In the center is the South Bay division in Chula Vista with its concentration of routes between downtown San Diego and the border. And on the right is the East County division operating most of the routes in that area. Since getting the charging infrastructure in place is key to deploying the electric buses, the first step is to ensure that the 4 divisions we're talking about are upgraded with the necessary equipment in the right order to prioritize disadvantaged communities. We can look at this in a number of different ways, but I wanted to illustrate 2 methods on this slide here. Using the definition of a DAC route to be any route that it has at least one stop in a disadvantaged community, we looked at the percentage of routes operated from each division that are DACs, as well as the percentage of ridership on these routes from each division. So focusing on the highlight box on the right, in the lower right, it shows that by using either the number of routes or the number of riders, the South Bay division has the highest percentage of DAC service of all of our 4 divisions. The combined Imperial Avenue and Kearny Mesa divisions follow, with East County then as the lowest percentage of disadvantaged routes or riders served. There are other metrics that could be used, including hours, total miles, route mileage within disadvantaged communities, and many other different metrics, but we expect that the results would largely follow the same order.
Hey, Dennis. So Mike talked about the infrastructure of the transition plan prioritizing the South Bay facility first, and that would also help us to serve DACs the best, right? Disadvantaged communities.
Yes, according to this data, what we're showing is that the greatest majority of our routes that serve DACs are operated out of the South Bay division. So that meshes well with our plans since we already have some work done on the planning for the South Bay division. We're also implementing a route in the next couple of years called Iris Rapid. That's going to be electric articulated buses, 60-foot buses that'll be operated out of the South Bay division, opening in 2022 or 2023. So with this information, we're making a proposal for your consideration and for your feedback today that the South Bay division be the highest priority for upgrades to accommodate the electric buses. Next would be improvements at the Imperial Avenue and Kearny Mesa divisions, followed by our East County division. And note that some of these improvements may happen simultaneously at more than one division, but the idea is to prioritize that they are completed first and in operation first at divisions in this order. Once we've established the order of the infrastructure installation, we propose policies and procedures that prioritize assigning ZEBs to the disadvantaged communities and routes that operate through those communities. We can do this in the same way that our rapid fleet is dedicated to those specific rapid routes. Those buses are stored and parked in separate lanes at each division. So when a driver pulls a bus for a route that serves a disadvantaged community, they're simply directed to those lanes that house the zero emissions buses. We aren't today proposing a specific route, list of routes. These will change over time as our network adjusts and the Cal and Virus screen updates with new data. But as we move forward, we can keep an updated list of prioritized routes based on the SB 535 DACs. We can also record the the deployment of these routes by route for public review. And we're doing that now for the zero emission bus pilot. All of that's available on our website, and we can continue this for accountability and transparency. So that concludes my presentation. We're happy to hear your reactions and your feedback as we continue to work on the transition plan.
Okay, now it's time for question and answer. So I want to see, we have one person with their hand raised, and that's Julio. So Julio, Stacy will unmute you. If you could please unmute yourself, and you can go ahead and ask a question.
Yes, I am Maria Cortez, AKA Julio. I'm with the City Heights CDC. Hi, I am asking, where does City Heights fall into the disadvantaged communities? Because it's about time those of us that live south of the 8 get noticed from the electric buses. I want to know where do we stand in that, and for the empty lots or even empty buildings that stand so vacant for so long, why not start using some of those empty buildings to be used as charging stations also?
Dennis, do you want to start out with where does City Heights fall into the disadvantaged communities definition that you just laid out?
Sure, Maria, thank you very much. I'm so glad that you were able to participate today. You're one of those people I always think of when I think of people that are just so engaged and interested in what we're doing. So I appreciate your call and your question. When we look at the disadvantaged communities as defined by the Senate Bill 535, there's a small section of City Heights that's included. It's south of about Myrtle or Dwight, between Fairmont and the 805 freeway. So it's a fairly small portion. So what we did to account for that is, in this proposal, is we're proposing to consider any route with at least one stop in a disadvantaged community as a disadvantaged community route. So what that does is it includes routes that go through City Heights, even though the greater portion of City Heights, University Avenue, Elkhorn Boulevard, et cetera, is not in a DAC. It would include a lot of routes that travel through City Heights. So I'm including Route 7 that comes out of downtown. East Village is a DAC, so that includes Route 7, Route 215, Route 235. National City is a DAC, so routes 13 and 955 that come up through City Heights from National City would be included in that. So really, we are actually incorporating most of the routes in City Heights. And then the other question that it gets back to is what divisions do these operate out of? Route 955, for example, operates out of South Bay. Most of the other routes operate out of Imperial Avenue or Kearny Mesa divisions. So those would be the next to follow. But certainly by including the definition of DAC routes as any route with at least one stop in a disadvantaged community, we include almost all of the services in City Heights.
And I think Maria had a second part of that question was about in-route charging possibly on vacant lands, possibly in the mid-city area, City Heights area. So Mike, do you want to add on to that, and what kind of analysis is done?
Sure, Mark, thank you. So yeah, as one of our scenarios, it's actually scenario 2, we looked at the possibility of on-route charging. And as technology advances and improves, some of our early data may change, but with the maximum limit with the battery electric vehicle right now in the land acquisition costs, a lot of the opportunity charging, that's what we call on-route charging that we've looked at, is in our own transit centers. And it does create some limitations as far as service, maintaining your service schedules, because you're forced to have a layover for charging. But we've also looked at other properties as a possibility as kind of like a satellite depot where we could store the vehicles there and charge the vehicles and not necessarily even have an operating division or a maintenance facility out there for a couple of reasons. One, to take advantage of maybe some property that's not being as well used, but really to balance out the grid within our region. If we can spread out like we do with the trolley, although the electricity is the highest cost of the operating costs associated with the electric vehicle, the trolley, because we spread out the load of electricity throughout the community, it reduces the overall cost, because electricity is, you're paying for the kilowatt, but you're really paying for when you need it and where you need it and how much at one specific time. So if you can balance it out, but those are all good ideas.
And yes, we are looking at all those options. And as we transition a little further along in our transition period, as we reach those limits with the range, we may have to look at on-route charging.
Okay, so we have time for 2 more questions before we wrap up. And the first one is going to be Brian. So Brian, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, I want to thank you all for the workshop today. Very, very good information. I run a nonprofit in Southeast San Diego. I like the idea of decentralizing the charging concept. It makes sense, as with the trolleys. So wherever that's possible, that'll probably, well, I don't know, but I would suggest that maybe looking more into that, it makes sense. The other things I wanted to really just bring up was it would be really nice to have an MTS equity workshop as well in the future. There are opportunities that were created way back before the 40s when certain districts were redlined. And I would venture to guess when you look at that CalEnviro map, you will see remarkable similarities with the boundaries of the redlining communities. So with that, I have been sort of pushing using that as a starting point of providing more investment, more resources, and more services in these areas. And MTS would be a very good entity in which to explore changing their priorities. Perhaps moving this up in certain areas is not an idea of money, but changing priorities. I just want to invite you to use the old redlining map that I think Green Lining Institute in Oakland provides a pretty accurate one for our community. And to dig more in the weeds from an equity standpoint, I still, and I understand because I've been around a while, that outreach is very difficult, especially in this coronavirus environment. But that may provide some ideas as to how to reach deeper into some of these communities so we could actually address some of the real concerns that are being discussed and maybe some that aren't being discussed. Yeah, because I mean, as I was taking notes, I have questions about the economic development standpoint, how much of an outreach was made to get some of those upcoming electrical jobs into underserved communities, those opportunities. There could be advantages of outreach through smartphones, even though we don't have a whole lot of computers and internet action going on out here. About 20% of people don't have it, and I'm not really sure if that's still accurate or not. But having some sort of mechanism where you could text these questions to people, since everybody's got smartphones. And I know the county tried it a couple years ago, and I thought it worked pretty effectively. So things like that, if we were to have some sort of an equity-driven, centered workshop, might.
Thank you, Brian. Those are all great ideas, and we are intending to have other workshops in addition to this zero emission bus. And one I do believe was intended to be an equity workshop, but those are great ideas.
Excellent.
We have time for the one more question, and Gretchen, I think we're going to open the lineup for you if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
I think I have successfully unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, you have.
Thank you. So I wanted to make sure that I could lob in some comments representing the 3,400 members of IBW 569 before we concluded. First and foremost, thank you so much for holding this community workshop. We're really looking forward to reviewing all the information that you provided today in further detail. And as noted in prior forums, IBW 569, along with our sister local 465 and our allies in the Transportation Equity Working Group, have identified several concerns about the draft ZEB transition proposal and urged the following. 1, pertaining to environmental justice, feel strongly that you need to prioritize ZEB deployment in the top 25% of disadvantaged communities using the latest version of the Cal Enviro Screen as required by CARB. 2, for workforce training and safety, we hope that you incorporate the workforce language provided by IBW 569 and 465. We appreciate the constructive dialogue that we've been having with MTS on the workforce language, and we hope to finalize this soon. And then 3, we wish for you to model 2 alternate scenarios to accelerate the ZEB transition and include the GHG analysis for all the scenarios. In addition to the base case scenario that has already been prepared, provide 2 additional scenarios. 1 should outline the steps to transition by 2030, and then the other should model a minimum of 25% of MTS bus purchases from 2020 to 2023 are ZEBs. And we'd like you to include GHG analysis for all 3 scenarios. And finally, to ensure meaningful community engagement moving forward, we propose the following public participation schedule: a public comment period occurring from July 21st, today, to August 4th. And then we hope that you release the updated plan with all 3 scenarios and the GHG analysis on August 21st, and then present the 3 detailed scenarios to the executive committee at their September meeting. And we just want to thank you so much again for this workshop, and we look forward to future collaborations.
All right, thank you very much, Gretchen. So that's it for this section. Now we just have a couple of polls, and we want to give you some next steps, but we thank everybody for hanging on with us for the full 2 hours. So a lot of you did, so that's great. So let's go into this, we have final polls here. How important is it to you that deployment of zero emissions buses in disadvantaged communities are prioritized over other areas? So is it A, very important, B, somewhat important, C, somewhat not important, or D, not important at all? Stacy's tallying the results. Okay, so we have 80 plus thinks it's very important, A. So that's certainly an overwhelming response. So thank you for your answers on that one. And I think we have one final polling question. So as an initial reaction, do you think MTS is on the right track with this 20-year, 2040 transition plan? A, very much on the right track. B, somewhat on the right track. C, somewhat on the wrong track. Or D, very much on the wrong track. So we're getting the results in. They're tallying. Okay, so it looks like B is the winner. So that's somewhat on the right track, and then next is A, very much on the right track. So thank you very much for that feedback. So we just want to give you some next steps right now as we're looking at it and what's going to happen. So we have the pilot program that Kyle presented on earlier. That's ongoing. We continue to work with SDG&E and the SB 350 program. We're still looking at that early fleet transition, as Mike talked about, with the Iris Rapid, and we're going to be getting 12 60-foot electric buses for the Iris Rapid. So that's an exciting project. The South Bay facility charging and design as part of the infrastructure, that's really the first major step that we're going to have. Also, as Mike mentioned, we're scouring, looking forward to secure additional funding for all the transition costs that we're looking at. And then we're going to share the public workshop results from today with the MTS board. And then eventually we'll be getting to, in the near future, submitting CARB, our transition plan. So those are just some major milestones that we're looking at hitting here in the near future. And again, we appreciate everybody joining us. We want you to give you anybody have any final comments, you can place them in the chat room and we can read them out, or if you want to really quick, we can, on any kind of topics, we can put that out there as just some final comments. If anybody wants to get anything out there to wrap this up.
And I do want to mention to you all that we're looking at probably taking our next step with the board going to their executive committee meeting in September. We haven't finalized that yet, but so that should give us the month of August to really fine tune and take a lot of the comments we've already received and really make sure that everybody gets a chance to participate in this process.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. And again, thank you everybody for participating. We appreciate it. And again, we have a Zero Emissions Bus dedicated webpage, and we will be updating that frequently. We will be putting all of this information on it, and as well as the presentation. We will also have a commenting box that we're going to be setting up there, so people who weren't able to participate today will have an opportunity to view the presentation, view the materials, and then also provide their comments and questions, and we'll be able to answer them at that time as well. So certainly we want to have ample public participation throughout this process. It's an ongoing process, and again, I want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope everybody has a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.